Hi, Clint Hayes with Zeamer'sEagerBeavers.com. If you are watching this, you probably learned about the crew through their June 16, 1943 mission to Bougainville and Buka Islands. And naturally so, because it is the mission that made them the most highly decorated aircrew in American history and is becoming one of the most famous missions in military aviation, period. As incredible as that mission was, though, it was only the climax to the crew's story. There were actually a number of other missions that were flown either by individual members of the crew or the crew themselves together that were just as notable, some of which were the subjects of newspaper articles across the country. And I thought it would be kind of cool to dedicate a series of videos to describing those other missions, this being the first one. The first one that we're going to look at is Jay Zeamer's reconnaissance mission to Rabaul on November 20th, 1942. The mission was absolutely essential to the future formation of the crew, and it also illustrates aspects of, I think it might actually illustrate Zeamer's personality in some ways more so than the June 16th, 43 Medal of Honor mission. I'll let you be the judge of that. They certainly portray different parts of his personality. Taking the two together, you really get a feel for who this gentleman was. But anyway, let's just jump into it. Okay, so when are we in the story? We're in November 1942. Zeamer has been in the theater for about 9 months, almost 9 months, since February of 42. And remember that he transferred down originally with the 22nd Bomb Group, which of course is a B-26 group, not a B-17 group. He was transferred into the 22nd from the 43rd while he was at Langley before the war. He's said in a few places that they took all the second lieutenants at Langley and sent them to Wright Field to help flight test the B-26. So he was one of these. He ended up never returning to the 43rd before the war. He ended up staying with the 22nd, and they did some sub-patrols off the coast of California, and then once the war started, come February, they all headed down to the Southwest Pacific Theater. So he's been there, again, for about 9 months. They've flown, by my count, 10 missions. He says there were 12, but he's a combat veteran at this point. So come September of 42, he is a combat veteran with quite a lot of hours already under his belt. But he cannot get over the hump in terms of landing the B-26. He hasn't transitioned to first pilot, which would allow him to fly combat in the B-26 and for the 22nd Bomb Group. So he, at this point, is shooting 3 to 6 landings a day, trying to get over this, trying to find some way that he can become pilot and get his own crew. That's his entire goal. He wants to get his own crew that he can train in his fashion to take into combat. But he can't do it. He's been stuck now for almost 15 months, I believe, in terms of being in the B-26 and having his issues with it, not being able to become first pilot. The basic issue is that the B-26 had a very high wing load, which meant that you had to be very aggressive in getting it on the ground when you're coming in for a landing. In almost all other respects, Zeamer was a first-class pilot in the B-26, but he would scare the bejesus out of the other pilots when they let him try to land. He just had too relaxed an attitude for the plane, according to Walt Krell, who was one of the primary pilots in the 19th Bomb Squadron of the 22nd and one of Zeamer's best friends back to flight school. And they tried repeatedly to help him get over it, and they just couldn't. So come September, Zeamer's really feeling stuck, doesn't know what to do. He never gets frustrated. Walt Krell said that about him. He said he never saw Zeamer frustrated. He said he was just unflappable that way. He would never show anything like that. But clearly Zeamer is wanting out. And about that time, the 43rd Bomb Group is being reassembled by General Kinney. Now that he's arrived in theater, he's bringing the group back together. And in fact, according to the paperwork, they didn't even know the 43rd existed at that point. So this is a pleasant surprise to General Kinney, and he started having the 43rd's constituent squadrons all brought together at Torrens Creek in Australia, up in Queensland. And in the process of doing that, they are starting to get, the 403rd is starting to get some of these B-17s, these fresh new B-17Fs that have been coming into the theater. And Zeamer sees these and thinks, maybe that's where I need to be. So, come September, end of September, he decides to go ahead and finagle a transfer. Now, it wasn't quite that simple. There was an incident that happened with Walt Krell that I'll get into in another video. It's really an extraordinary story just in its own right. But Zeamer decides it's just time. And he finagles a transfer into the 403rd Bomb Squadron of the 403rd. So remember, when he gets into the 403rd, he's never flown a B-17 before. Okay, he's seen them before. He said there was a B-17D at one of the bases he was at when he was in flight school, but it was only reserved for officers, and he was not an officer yet, so he wasn't able to fly it. So he's never flown the B-17 before. And he also, as far as he knows, doesn't know anybody in the 43rd, well, in this 403rd Bomb Squadron. He, remember, at Langley, once he graduated, he went into the 43rd, very briefly, was in the 63rd Bomb Squadron, and in fact was Squadron Executive Officer. But he didn't last that long before they transferred him to Wright Field to help flight test the B-26. So when he's coming into the 403rd, he thinks he doesn't know anybody. He's not familiar with the 403rd Bomb Squadron. Well, as it turns out, the 403rd is just the redesignated 13th Reconnaissance Squadron. And who was in the 13th Reconnaissance Squadron since before the war began? Well, that would be Joe Sarnoski. Of course, Sarnoski and Zeamer did meet at Langley prior to the war and got to be friends, knew each other for probably a month, maybe two, before Zeamer got split off and war took them off in their own directions. They did not expect to be reunited in the Southwest Pacific about, 15 months later, 14 months later. So it was a pleasant reunion, but Sarnoski was not available at that point in time. All right, the 403rd has been down there for months too, since February actually. And they are beginning to get their own planes in, finally. They've been stuck down in Melbourne, at Laverton Air Base, down on the southern coast of Australia. Sarnoski has been feeling stuck himself because he wants to sink his 5 ships, according to the letters that he sent home. And the 403rd is stuck down there in southern Australia, far away from the combat zone, largely being a service squadron for the planes of the 19th Bomb Group that have been getting beat up since the Philippines. And he's champing at the bit to get going. Well, finally in September, they start getting their own planes and they form up their own crews. So Sarnoski is already taken. He is, in fact, the bombardier for the squadron commander, Major Nick Charles. So he's not available. And in fact, no one is available. So when Zeamer comes into the 403rd, he's got nowhere to go, especially. All he can do is do his Zeamer thing and try to work his way into the pilot seat, which is exactly what he does. So he transfers into the 403rd on September 22nd, 1942. Over the next several weeks, he is the self-described squadron errand boy. He is transporting planes between the various air bases, transporting personnel, parts delivery, this sort of a thing. Whatever he can do outside of the intelligence work and some other things they had him doing around the squadron. Come Halloween, as a part of that, he pulls another Zeamer and gets himself into the right seat of on a combat mission for a different squadron and a different group altogether. Again, this is another one that I'll do another video about. But over Halloween, he flies a few combat missions, one of which is with Kenneth McCullough, who has already become a legend in the 43rd Bomb Group. And it's on that mission that Zeamer discovers how the B-17 can actually be flown. And that flips a switch, and he's really ready to get busy. Unfortunately, after these, he goes right back to errand type missions. So, and one of which is flying with Major Charles to help transfer the squadron up to Milne Bay, but he's not getting into combat. So That brings us to the November 20th mission. Okay, so we know about this mission at all because of two sources, one of which is Zeamer himself. Back in the 90s, an author, historian, now a good friend of mine, Joseph Bowman, was in the process of assembling biographies of all 62 Air Force Medal of Honor recipients. Obviously, one of those is Jay Zeamer. And Zeamer happened to also be Joe's idol and hero. So they struck up kind of a special friendship. And as part of his research, Joe received from Jay a letter detailing some of his more notable missions, one of which was this November 20th mission, because it ended up being so important to his career in the war. So we have that source, a letter from Zeamer himself. We also have an entry in a fairly fascinating combat diary kept by Sergeant Bill Eaton, who had just come into the 403rd not long before. He transferred in from the 19th Bomb Group, as did another member of Jay's crew, later crew. And he flew belly turret on this mission. Sometimes he would fly as a waist gunner, but normally he was belly, and that's what he was on this mission. And he had a very particular experience on this mission that, again, helps illustrate, well, a couple of things. It illustrates Zeamer's approach, and it also illustrates what would become a bit of a theme later once Zeamer and Sarnoski were trying to put together a crew. But those are the two sources that we have. So if we get to the mission itself, we're going to start out with a letter from Zeamer. And I thought instead of trying to just summarize these or paraphrase them myself, I thought it'd be fun to just read straight from the letters. So we start with Zeamer. He says, for 3 days, the reconnaissance planes sent to Rabaul to photograph Simpson Harbor had come back reporting solid weather up to 27,000 feet and came back with no information. The general staff was quite fearful that the Japanese were preparing a convoy to send down to reinforce their bases on New Guinea, and they urgently needed information on what was going on in the harbor there. Okay, so what's he talking about there? It would be good to have a little bit of context for that. So let's look at some maps. Okay, so I wanted to start with those overview map just to illustrate the point that at this point in time, most of the combat squadrons were still based here in Australia, primarily at Iron Range and Mariba. Some of the 43rd squadrons were still based down here in Torrens Creek. And of course, as I just mentioned a little bit ago, the 403rd had actually transferred their duty station over here to Milne Bay, here at the southeastern tip of New Guinea. So they were actually up in the combat zone. But they were still originating at these other bases and only staging through Port Moresby, which was the primary air base, the Allied air base in the theater. Now, to look at the actual main combat zone, we're going to switch over here to another map that gives you a better look at the actual combat zone. And here you can see Rabaul up here on the far northeastern tip of New Britain. Of course, here's Bougainville and Buga Islands, which will figure in the cruise story significantly come the next June. But you can also see over here Buna and Gona, Leh, and some of these other bases, these Japanese-held bases at the time that would figure very prominently in the coming years. But at this point in time, for this mission, we're talking about their mission from Port Moresby up here to Rabaul, which is almost exactly 500 air miles away. And these missions would typically be anywhere from 6 to 8 hours, depending on what they ended up doing on the way there, on the way back. And in fact, on this mission, on the way back, they overfly Buna and then make their way back to Port Moresby. So with that context, let's jump right into the mission itself. Okay, so now we switch over to Bill Eaton's account. Now, you've got to remember that Zeamer was still not on anyone's crew at this point. He's still trying to fill in wherever he can. Now, dengue fever and malaria were wreaking havoc on the squadron at this point. New Guinea in general, but especially at Milne Bay. They actually refer to it as Malaria Bay sometimes. So it's perfectly possible that that Hokut's regular co-pilot was just out sick, and that's how Zeamer was able to become the assigned co-pilot on the mission. But however it happened, he was the assigned co-pilot as far as they were concerned when they were ready to take off. So we switch over to Bill Eaton's account. He says, Hokut was first pilot, and somehow while taxiing toward the runway, we mired in the mud and had to wait for a tow. This gave us a later than scheduled start, and during the delay, Hokut became co-pilot and Zeamer took over as pilot. Now, how Zeamer talked his way into the pilot seat is an open question. But again, it's just what he did. He was famous for saying there's always a way. He would find a way. Just another note, according to Zeamer's letter, there was also a Navy captain aboard with them that day as an observer who they needed to be able to analyze the traffic in Simpson Harbor there at Rabaul, so the Navy could know for sure what they were up against, if indeed the Japanese Navy was trying to get more personnel to Buna. All right, so we pick up again with Bill Eaton. He says, takeoff from Port Moresby was at 09:45. He says, we took off and got up over Rabaul at noon at 27,000 feet. It was still socked in solid. Now, obviously you can't do reconnaissance at night, but it was extremely dangerous to do any missions over Rabaul during the day. This would come up repeatedly, and in fact, the crew, the Eager Beavers, were awarded for many of them, their first Silver Stars for a daylight mission they would fly later in 1943, in April of 43. And so it was no small thing to do this, which again figures into why Zeamer would end up getting the Silver Star. This crew would all receive the Silver Star for this mission as well. So he says it was still socked in solid. Back to Eaton. He says, we were supposed to stay at altitude over Rabaul, but it was completely covered by clouds. And evidently the importance of knowing what was in the harbor caused Zeamer to decide on going down until we could see the place. All right, and again, this is a theme with Zeamer. He wasn't content to just bail on a mission if there were obstacles in the way. He always tried to see what he could do to overcome whatever obstacles there were. He was always trying to move the chains however he could. Back to Zeamer. He says, in the distance, I could see Cavieing on the northern tip of New Ireland. I flew and circled over it and went down to the navigator and asked him to plot a course, time, and distance to Simpson Harbor. I knew there was a volcano on the edge of the harbor that was always emitting hot air. And I reasoned that the air above the harbor down below had to be clear. Okay, so let's go to the map again, and I want to show you a couple of photos of Rabaul, and just to get our bearings here. Okay, so to get our bearings here, here's Rabaul, here's Cavieing up here on the farther northern tip of New Ireland. So the crew is flying from this direction towards Rabaul from Port Moresby. And as they come up towards Rabaul, he's saying that socked in, so they headed up towards Cavieing. Hopefully I'm pronouncing that correctly. Circled around and decided to come in to Rabaul from the north. Now, what does Rabaul look like? Let's get our bearings on that. He's talking about these volcanoes and Simpson Harbor. So where are we talking about? Well, here's Simpson Harbor right here. All right, this is Rabaul town. There were air bases strewn all around here. Rapopo, Vuna Canal, Lacunae, and these are the two primary bases. Lacunae and Vuna Canal. These were the two primary air bases that were the focus of almost all Allied attacks on aircraft by the Allies. And most of the shipping, whenever you read about bombing shipping in at Rabaul, they're talking about primarily here in Simpson Harbor. And of course, here are the volcanoes that they're talking about. There's this one, and this one just north of Rabaul town. They're also referred to as the mothers and daughters. You can actually see that in this next map here. Let's see. Yeah, here's one, and here's another, and then Here's the one behind Rabaul town. You can see the town stretching around here. The Kunai airfield is here. Matupi Island, that's about to get mentioned here. And of course, Buna Canal is down this direction on the other side. But here's Simpson Harbor. You can see all the shipping in the harbor. And there would be varying amounts. And, once you sail out of Simpson Harbor, you get into Blanche Bay and back out into St. George's Channel, which is going to come up here in a little bit as well. But as the arrow indicates, this direction is north. So the crew is going to be coming in to Rabaul from this direction. All right. Which looks something like this. This is a little bit more from the northwest, so they might have been coming in more like this. But you can see just this sort of reverse angle here. Here's Blanche Bay out here. Here's Matupi Island. Here's Simpson Harbor. Lacuna's over here. So this is kind of sort of the angle that the crew would have had as they were coming up on Rabaul. So, picking up on the account from there, Zeamer says, so we flew back toward Rabaul, letting down, and sure enough, we broke out in the clear at the north edge of Simpson Harbor. So, he's talking about this side. At the precise time the navigator had given me. Eaton says that they were right over one of the airstrips, which probably means Lacunae. So if they were coming in over this direction, they were counting on the volcano clearing the air out, so they've come in sort of over this direction, according to Eaton, over Lacunae Airdrome. Zeamer says they were at 8,000 feet. Eaton says they're at 10,000 feet, moving in the direction of the harbor. Zeamer says the harbor lay wide open before us and had more ships in it than I had seen before. Now they had, between the two of them, there were 15 to 20 zeros at their altitude in this at the top of this large dome of clear air, as Zeamer describes it. He says there were 15. Eaton said at least 20 were flying at our altitude. So at this point, Zeamer makes a hard dive, Eaton says, to 3,000 feet for a small cluster of clouds over Matupi Island. Okay. Zeamer says he was doing S-turns as they crossed the harbor to the south edge. We had our Reco camera clicking on an intervalometer, and all crew members were busy counting ships, all of which were shooting at us. The count averaged 110. Now, when he's talking about their reconnaissance camera and the intervalometer, just to give you an idea of what he's talking about there, this is the K-17 camera that was primarily used for photography, mapping in general, in the theater. Now, you can see these measurements, 6 inches, 12 inches, 24-inch focal lengths on this thing, 9 by 9 inches. Well, to get a feel for how big that actually is, that's this. It's a big camera. And my understanding from a gentleman whose father served in the 20th Mapping Squadron was that they would actually strap these guys in. If they were doing it handheld, they would actually be strapped to the interior of the plane. To be able to hold these things through the waist window to do the photography. If it was mounted in the plane, it could be on an intervalometer, which was just an instrument that would take timed photographs as they passed over, and they could set that. And later, that would be George Kendrick's job with the Eager Beavers when they would do any of their mapping missions. All right, so we're back to the account. So they're diving down, and Zeamer's doing his S-turns to get away. They've counted an average of 110 ships in Simpson Harbor. Eaton says some zeros made passes at us while we were diving, but most of them were still a good distance behind. My turret door came off in the dive, and I had a hell of a time hanging on. So Zeamer has dived the plane so precipitously that apparently the suction has ripped off the door to the hatch of the belly turret. And Bill Eaton is just having to hang on for dear life. The navigator, he says the navigator talked to Zeamer while we were circling in the clouds as to when to leave the clouds without heading back into the harbor. We came out of the clouds right over Rabaul Harbor at 3,000 feet. back to Zeamer. He says, when we broke out of the cloud, we faced a Zero coming at us head on and firing. I made a violent turn to the right and thought I had avoided his fire. Eaton picks up there. He says they escaped without further attack. The theory is that there were so many Zeros in the air that no anti-aircraft fire could be used, and the Zeros were too busy missing each other to figure out where we were going when we broke out. Zeamer says we were now in the clear and headed out over St. George's Channel and down toward Buna. Okay, so at this point, their primary mission objective, Rabaul, is completed. They have headed out over St. George's Channel and are heading back towards Port Moresby. But along the way, as Zeamer says, we had been asked to observe Buna on our way home. The report was that our ground troops had captured it the day before. Now remember, this mission was on November 20th of 42. So he's talking about November 19th. Eaton says, we had been briefed this morning that our troops had captured the airstrip at Buna. So we lined up to buzz the strip, as you do. All right, so let's see what they're talking about on the map. Okay, so again, here's Rabaul up here. They've flown out over St. George's Channel, and they are on their way back to Port Moresby, and look at that. That takes them almost directly over Buna. So it's an easy ask in terms of, hey, could you check out Buna on the way home to see what's going on there? Now, here's where it gets interesting. Now, actually, just as a bit of context, further context, why were the Japanese so interested in Buna? Well, again, it's straight across from Port Moresby. All right. Now, the Battle of the Coral Sea was important earlier in the year because the Japanese wanted to take Port Moresby, and they were going to attempt to do that by sea at first, but they returned back to the Battle of the Coral Sea. So once they were denied that, they decided to try to take it overland from Buna and Gona. There is a small footpath, almost literally a one-man footpath, that crossed over New Guinea, over the Owen Stanley Mountains, which at points reach up over 13,000 feet, that the Japanese decided we're going to try to take Moresby across that. It was a rather foolhardy endeavor, almost fantastic considering the terrain, but because this is all jungle. New Guinea is some of the most primitive jungle on Earth. There's still native tribes living there that are essentially still living in their original hunter-gatherer state. So this is really primitive, environment. But the Japanese nonetheless decided to give it a go. And in fact, if I remember correctly, they got within 30 miles of Port Moresby before finally getting turned back by the combined Allied attacks from the air and overwhelming heroic effort by the Australian Army. But they did turn it back. So now the Allies are just trying to extricate Japan from Buna and Gona completely once and for all. So because Rabaul was where everything from Japan came through Rabaul. So any reinforcements were going to be coming from here, whether it was down to the Solomons, over here to New Guinea, southern New Guinea, northern New Guinea, it all came through Rabaul first. So that's why they were wanting to see what kind of shipping was going on and trying to stop any more reinforcements from getting to Buna. And you can see that a little bit better on this next map. Take a note at the date here, 19 November through 14 December for the attack on Buna. So again, the mission was on November 20th. So when Zeamer is talking about the day before, he's talking about November 19th, the day that this attack started. So what he's essentially saying is there were some reports that the Allies had taken the airstrip, which would be this new airstrip, on November 19th. And they were going to overfly it just to basically say huzzah and congratulate the troops on the ground. What they found was a very different situation. Zeamer picks up. He says, but when we flew by Buna at 5,000 feet, several miles offshore, we observed several Zeros that appeared to be taking off. We learned later that they were back strafing our troops. We were going through an area of widely scattered clouds and observed 8 Zeros milling around. Eaton says, we started receiving anti-aircraft fire, and 9 Zeros took off from the strip as we dragged it. Zeamer says, I pushed the throttles forward in an effort to get through this area before they observed us, but we didn't make it. Eaton says, I was on side gun when we came back across Buna. And this is pretty common for waist gunners and belly turret gunners to fill in on the waist as necessary. But so he's on the side gun when they came back over Buna. He says, I left the side guns and got into the ball turret without the door on it. Sam Atchu, took my place, Porky Atchu actually was his nickname, took my place on the side gun. The dogfight took place, and this is still Eaton, at near treetop altitude, with Zeamer using the low altitude to keep them busy, watching for hills and denying them the belly attack since the ball turret was out. Now, to get an idea of what that looks like, this is a B-25 coming out over, this isn't treetop level, but it's not too far from it. Now, again, this is back at Rabaul, but it's indicative. Now, I just wanted to give you an idea of, what that looks like. When you're down on the deck, you've reduced the area available for the Japanese to attack by 50%. They have to attack from above. So, picking up from there, Eaton says, Wilson was riding in the tail and shot down 2 of the Zeros. One blew up and the other went down burning. Zeamer says, one came in on our tail and one came up on each side, but the one on the left lagged considerably. Now, at this point, their tail gunner, I have to combine the two a little bit. The tail gunner, Sam Wilson, Atchu was the other waist gunner. So Sam Wilson is the tail gunner. Zeamer says he quickly shot down the tail attacker. Eaton says, I didn't get to do any shooting because the pilot didn't know I would get back into the lower turret, and dropped a wing on all low attacks, taking my turret out of firing position. So he's just saying that Zeamer is dropping a wing down. He's turning, and this is something that Zeamer would end up doing, and this is what came up later on the Medal of Honor mission after they were able to dive down to 10,000 feet. This is Zeamer's technique. He would turn into the approaching Zeros to close the gap as quickly as possible. It was a variation on a maneuver that he learned in the 22nd Bomb Group with the B-26s. In that case, they would turn just inside the Zeros so that the Zeros would keep rolling and rolling and rolling because they only had those fixed guns. So they would keep trying to get their fixed guns onto the bomber, and in the process keep rolling and rolling and rolling, and Walt Krill said they would almost roll them completely over sometimes. But in this case, Zeamer is just turning into the Zeros and closing the gap. And that's what Eaton is sort of complaining about here. He's being taken out of firing position because Zeamer's turning the belly turret up away from the Zero. He says, I had no interphone since I couldn't keep a headset on in the slipstream. I spent most of my time cussing the Japs and hanging on. Zeamer handled that B-17 like a pea shooter. And by pea shooter, he means a fighter. That was just lingo that they had at the time for fighters. And that was not the first time that somebody would complain that Zeamer was flying the B-17 like a fighter. Now, at this point, Atchu, according to Eaton, split another Zero with Calderola in the upper turret. Zeamer says, as the Zero on the right dipped his left wing to come in, I turned sharply to the right, forcing him to pull up. And as he did so, I pulled up under his belly, giving Sergeant Calderola in the top turret a close shot. He flamed him in short order. Zeamer goes on. He says, I figured by then the one on the left should be coming in, so I did a vertical reversement to the left, and just in time. He had pulled up and was coming in. My sharp turn to the left was forcing him to pull up, and I pulled up hard under his belly, as I had done to the one on the right. Calderola seemed flustered and unable to get on him, so I kept pulling up closer and closer until I felt that I was punching Calderola's guns into the Zero's belly. Finally, Calderola flamed him. The crew was shouting like at a football game. But in pulling up so hard to get that last one, the Fortress stalled and went into a tailspin. I pushed the nose down and straightened it out and headed toward home. We climbed up over the Owen Stanley Mountains and slid down the other side to Port Moresby. As we landed, and I believe I added a photo for this. Yeah. So this is coming into Port Moresby. Here's a B-17 coming into land. And you can actually see, this is looking out of another B-17 at the time. So they're coming into land. And Zeamer says, as we landed, the left wing settled almost to the ground, and the plane pulled to the left off the runway. We had a flat tire. That attacker, as we came out of Simpson Harbor at Rabaul, had apparently put a machine gun bullet in our left tire. And in fact, Eaton backs that up. He says, we had a tire shot out and landed without knowing about it until we hit. Zeamer says, the general staff was elated. The Navy captain confirmed that a convoy was imminent. After that mission, no one asked if I had been checked out to fly the left seat of a B-17. At that point, Eaton informs Jay Zeamer that he's never going to fly with him again. And again, this would become a theme when Zeamer and Sarnoski began putting a crew together come January, after they got together at the very end of December. They went through a number of crew members who were most of them were more put off by Zeamer's constant volunteering. He volunteered for all of his missions. And it's nothing against it's nothing against anybody down there, because they're already down there risking their lives. They didn't see a point in trying to push it that way. And in fact, Hank Dominski himself, Zeamer's regular co-pilot, who was arguably, most likely, the first to join Zeamer's crew, he wasn't real happy about it either. He records in his diary that he didn't like how eager he was, but he came around once he'd gotten to fly with Zeamer enough. And but yeah, he wouldn't be the first one. They lost a good portion of the guys that had been flying with him at the end of January for this very reason. But as far as we know, Eaton was the first person to get to tell Zeamer, I'm not flying with you again. So Eaton continues. He says, we were supposed to be recommended for a Silver Star, but that's an old story. Just another day to talk about. Well, in fact, it wasn't just an old story at this time. As I mentioned before, they were all awarded Silver Stars for this mission. It was Zeamer's first. He'd receive another one for a mission over, again, a mission to Rabaul, a daylight mission, come the next April, April 12th of 43. So in fact, as Zeamer says, everyone on that flight was awarded a Silver Star, including our Navy friend. Now, at this point, again, Zeamer, was considered checked out. And that should have boded very well for him. He's finally gained the left seat. He apparently Hokut was impressed enough that he recommended that Zeamer go ahead and be transitioned and considered first pilot in the B-17 and able to fly combat. So now all Zeamer needs is a crew. Unfortunately, he gets stuck at Iron Range. Almost immediately after this, Major Charles assigns Zeamer to what appears to have been a service detail of sorts. Back in Iron Range, there's a good chance that they were taking care of some damaged B-17s back at Iron Range. We don't know for sure, but it's a group of Zeamer and another second lieutenant, I believe, were overseeing a bunch of corporals and privates. And Walter Krell, in his account in Martin Caden's Mission Over Buka chapter in his Caden's book Flying Forts, talks about Zeamer mentioned that he was part of a service detail. So if you put them together, that sort of adds up. But regardless, here at Zeamer's biggest triumph to date, in 8 weeks, after entering the 403rd as someone who's never flown the B-17 and doesn't have a crew, in 8 weeks he's risen from squadron errand boy to a combat pilot with a Silver Star. But instead of getting to go right into combat, he gets stuck at Iron Range, back in Australia, out of the combat zone for most of December. And it's kind of a blow, but Zeamer being Zeamer, he takes it in stride. 9 days after this is November 20th, 9 days after this, the event happens that will make the Eager Beavers as a crew possible. And I'll cover that in another video. Thanks for watching.